Thank you to the organizers. Can you hear me? Okay, so someone take a lead to the organizers of this event. Our presentation is the exploration of the feminization of Bientraitance of older speaking adults. This is research that's funded as part of an action concertée, funded through the QSC in Quebec. And this is our research team. Darla is our Meghan Joyce is one of the researchers on the project, myself as well, Morgan Seeley, and Erica Blattner is our partner, our community partner from the CHSSN, which is the Community Health and Social Services Network that serves the English-speaking population in Quebec. So today we're going to talk about Bientraitance, its history, its political history in Quebec, and the history of some research on Bientraitance. We're going to talk about briefly about the CHSSN and their centers for senior wellness centers. Bilingual, so my brain is getting back and forth. We're going to talk about the project we're doing, the objective of our project, and the methods that we followed, and then we're going to specifically of the Feminization de Bientraitance anglophone. So first, just to give you a brief history of Bientraitance. So it's been introduced in policy in Quebec, I would say, since the first Plan d'Action contre la Maltraitance that was developed in 2010. And this diagram demonstrates that it started out really discussion, or at least a political discussion about Bientraitance, really started through taking up Bientraitance against any specifically des années vulnérables, and then focusing specifically on the milieux de soins. I'm sorry, I'm going to do this. And then recently we've seen a shift towards more focus on Bientraitance, but still within the context of speaking about maltraitance specifically. And there's also been a shift recently in the third Plan d'Action contre la Maltraitance that is speaking about Bientraitance for all populations, but again, often less than any. And then and also we're not only focusing on the milieu de soins, we're talking about all contexts in the milieu. And so what is Bientraitance? What is good treatment? That's the way we're translating it. It's a terrible translation.
C'est ma question, c'est quoi en anglais?
Il y en a pas une traduction. So we're using the word good treatment. So I know a lot of discussion.
Sure, sorry, it fell down. Okay. I've been taking too much time. So it did not originate in Quebec. It's a term that came from France in the early 2000s, and it's been a source of a lot of debate and critical reflection ever since. The research literature demonstrates that it has been, several meanings have been attributed to it: a culture, mouvement, an approche, a position, an attitude. And it also demonstrates that these definitions generally align with pre-established concepts in health and social services, particularly the concept of person-centered care. And you can see this alignment by looking at this really long definition that the Quebec has developed of Bientraitance. There's certainly alignment with definitions of person-centered care. I won't go into detail about that. So that's a little bit about the history of Bientraitance. In terms of the research that's been done on Bientraitance in Quebec, it was initially an article written by Rouiller and Kueber. I did an accent. Anyway, there's no accent on Kueber. And that was really established that, you know, despite the fact that the language wasn't used in public policies, there was already like a visée éthique of trying to humanize care that we could see already in policies in Quebec. So that's kind of that literature. There's been written in the Travail Social and the Palmer, Chiquette, and Rouiller wrote about the fact that actually the values and principles that inform the framework for the Order of Social Workers and Marriage and Family Therapists of Quebec, that framework completely corresponds with the values and conditions of Bientraitance that is in the government policies. And according to them, at the end of their article, they asked, well, okay, that's great that there's this alignment, but do social workers actually experience working conditions that allow them to provide this approach?
in terms of the research on prochain.
So informal caregivers. There was also this kind of question and an argument that community organizations really need to be supported in providing Bientraitance. And then similarly in the research that's been done on d'hébergement, this kind of constat also comes out from that. So overall, the research demonstrates that Bientraitance is actually well established in public policy, and it's part of the professional and practices of those who are providing services and care to older adults. But we need the conditions that support its realization. Sorry.
I'm just gonna hold the mic, I think. Perfect. So to get into the project a little bit more, if you could just to the side. So as Sandra said, the CHSSN, it's a Quebec provincial organization. It's a nonprofit. It represents the health and social service needs and priorities of English speakers in the province, and it collaborates with government, service providers, and community organizations. It receives funds from the provincial and federal government, as well as from foundations, and it then distributes those funds to community organizations that help English speakers in Quebec to better accessing for kind of capacity building activities, communities of practice, networks, workshops, trainings, and that sort of thing. They have organizations in 16 of 17 regions in Quebec and soon in Northern Quebec. So in terms of the senior wellness centers that we're working with, these are community-run programs that aim to maintain and improve the health and well-being of English-speaking seniors. It helps them to improve their access and knowledge of health and social services, as well as to decrease their social isolation through programming. The Senior Wellness Center supports over 30 English-speaking organizations across Quebec. And what makes these centers unique is that they're very community-based and community-led collaborations with health and social services. They're culturally and linguistically adapted. They're not informed by a top-down approach, but they're very bottom-up in the communities represented. And there's no specific participation criteria. All older adults are welcome, and even younger older adults. And they're funded by the Secretariat for Relations with English-Speaking Quebecers. So in terms of our project, in English, we translate this as good treatment practices in senior centers and the promotion of active aging. So senior centers in Quebec have been recognized as a very key resource for meeting the needs of older adults, but how they actually play this role, how they actually do this, especially in relation to good treatment and active aging, has not really been researched. So this project is trying to fill this big research gap. Yes, it focuses on these senior wellness centers of the CHSSN, but it's also, the findings will also apply more broadly to other community organizations as well. The project has 4 objectives. 2 of them we're getting into today. The first is to document the meaning and significance of good treatment of older adults within these senior centers, including how that relates to active aging, and also to identify good treatment practices and barriers to those practices within those centers. So just very briefly in terms of the project methods, it basically consisted of a World Cafe and interviews. We also took demographic information with a demographic questionnaire. We asked about age, gender identity, language most comfortable speaking, ethno-racial identity, education, annual income, sexual identity, disabilities, religious affiliation, and a few other questions regarding how long they've lived in their community, how long they've participated in these centers. We have some key findings up on the slide, but we're really still in this process of analyzing this data. So it's very preliminary, but what we want to certainly point to right now is the fact that 85% of the participants in these World Cafes were women. So we did 4 World Cafes with older adults, their caregivers and or family members, volunteers, and staff at the centers. So 163 people participated. And we did this in 4 different contexts: an urban context, a rural context, a suburban context, and 1 World Cafe that was in an urban context with a group primarily composed of racialized older adults. We also did individual interviews with executive directors and coordinators of the different centers to deepen our understanding of their perspectives around their work around Bientraitance.
Okay, so we asked ourselves, why should we be interested in the feminization of senior wellness centers in relation to this conference today, and why it's important in relation to our data. And 5 minutes. Oh my God. Okay. 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 So really quickly, I was just going to speak to the literature a little bit about the feminization of aging. But what we want to do is go beyond the idea that this is just that the older population is more feminized because women live longer than men. We want to recognize that the participation of women in the senior wellness centers, both those who work there and the women who participate there, it's not just simply a reflection of that. And we want to look at how gendered relations shape and play out in the senior wellness centers and how they impact participants' understandings, experience, and access to Bientraitance. And to do this, we draw on the concept of social reproduction, particularly the work of Sarah Marie Hall. In her recent article entitled Social Reproduction as Social Infrastructure, she argues that we should use the language of social reproduction to describe community spaces rather than that of social infrastructure. Specifically, she recognizes why it has become more popular to try to valorize these spaces as social infrastructure, but she argues that we shouldn't be doing that because that disregards the gendered labor and processes of social reproduction that constitute, maintain, and sustain these spaces, and it really invisibilizes and doesn't acknowledge their position in the reproductive economy. So in relation to that, we asked 3 questions of our data. The first one was, why is access to the Centre pour Aînés, the senior wellness centers, was it important for older English women? English-speaking women in Quebec. One of the first reasons is that these were really welcoming and inclusive spaces where people were offered a coffee when they came in and they really felt like they belonged here. It was really important for them to have that sense of belonging, to have access to the resources that were being offered to them, resources that provided them some means of entertainment, but also learning in their language, feeling for some of them like they're part of a family. Having occasions to socialize, opportunities to learn, to recognize that they're able to learn still as older people, because that's not always recognized. And to learn about different types of technological advancements, and then also to have access to reliable information, to référencement and accompagnement, to have someone walk beside you. So in terms of the research literature on senior centers for older women, they echo, our findings echo them to a significant extent, that senior centers can help alleviate loneliness, improve networks, and build community, and support access to knowledge and health, to knowledge about health and transportation and other services. And they also recognize that there's a relationship between the feminization of poverty and older age, though that's not specific only to older age, and social participation, including some barriers that are faced around linguistic barriers as well.
Okay, so the second question is, what is the work of Bientraitance and who is doing this work? So who is doing this work? It's predominantly work that's being done by women. What is the work of Bientraitance? It's social reproduction work. So we can think about this formally. This is happening via the provision of programs and services, health and education promotion and activities, wellness check-ins, referrals, communicating and collaborating with folks. There's also a lot of hidden efforts and skills that are being done by staff that is manifesting as unpaid and underpaid work that's often provided outside of normal working hours, and that really extends the responsibilities of the senior wellness center mandates. This happens through 3 things: building relationships for good treatment. So this is often hidden and undervalued, this kind of empathetic listening, making others feel valued, considering feelings. Based on this listening, there's also a lot of coordinating with other centers in the community to try to get people different services. There's also a lot of trying to be aware of different contextual challenges that people might be facing around income, around health challenges. Second, it's also being done through advocacy work, so translation and referral work, resisting policies and practices sometimes. It's also done through maintaining and sustaining staff. So there's a real emphasis here on having to support staff's well-being. However, this kind of gets framed as training and self-care, and the social reproduction piece is not always taken into account, the fact that this is underpaid labor and work. For the next slide, some of the barriers that these older adults are facing, or these English-speaking women are facing, are health and mobility changes, especially when, you have to go take more medical appointments. You have to move to a residence. It's then harder to access English-speaking services. Caregiving that they may be undertaking takes time and energy. They might not be able to leave the home to be able to access the centers. Transportation is not always available and accessible, especially in the winter. We have language barriers, especially with Bill 96, that's reducing trust and belonging in the health and social service sector. Digital divides is a big problem still, and the housing crisis as well is creating a lot of stress for some of these people. Finally, some of the barriers for staff in providing Bientraitance are a lack of funding to expand services and to pay staff to do more referral work. Training costs, accompaniment and referrals are constantly asked for, but there isn't the money to actually pay for that. Meeting the needs and including the needs of older adults, especially when their mobility changes or they move to a residence. How can we go to the residence to offer that service? Filling gaps in transportation, these staff are doing. They're very concerned about weather and air quality, very concerned about language changes in Bill 96, and they're kind of filling gaps in translation. And this is resulting in a lot of staff burnout and fatigue. So, conclusion. The good treatment offered at senior wellness centers is essential for English-speaking women in Quebec, older women in Quebec. The work that is being done at these centers is social reproduction work and should be recognized as such, and that these barriers to good treatment need to be addressed, and that there are a lot of them. Merci.